Welcome to Pray for Rain. I'm your host, Jack Willis. It is good to be with you today. The other day, I was on the phone with a loved one, and I was airing some anxieties I was having recently about not getting enough sleep. I don't feel as sharp as I wanted to. And in my mind, this will set off some sort of OCD spiral where I will think, man, is this early onset dementia? You couldn't remember that word the other day that you wanted to. Is this schizophrenia? What is this? And to their credit, as loved ones tend to do, she said, no, that's nuts. You're not crazy. That thought loop is actually the crazy part. And I thought, man, I'm glad I said this. I feel somewhat better. And so I got off the phone, going about my life, and then my brain will do this thing where I'll think that I must have subconsciously withheld an accurate diagnosis of my symptoms in order to manipulate them into telling me that I'm okay. My mind won't allow me to accept a positive analysis that contradicts my own deep, dark thoughts about myself. I'll just think, oh, well, they're just saying that. I actually know. I know what's going on within me. And I do this for all kinds of things. I don't know when I started taking myself or my own thoughts about myself so seriously, but I'm reading this book called Inventing the Individual by Larry Seidentop right now, and it's making me wonder about if the invention of the individual as a concept has any bearing on my own personal neuroses. Is my self-rumination a consequence of the pressure to think of myself as this properly ordered individual, a rational actor? What's actually happening inside my mind? No, I don't think that worrying about one's sense of self constantly is a uniquely Western phenomenon, but I do think that there's a strong emphasis here in the West because of the way that our society is formed. And just for the record, I think that the invention of the individual in liberal democratic capitalism is right up there with the greatest things that we've ever done as humans. Just cannot speak highly enough of it. But every system and every way of being has trade-offs. And so I've been wondering if this is one of the trade-offs that we have. An emphasis on individuality makes me conceive of myself as this atomic unit, and therefore I think it's much more important that I properly order myself. Now, in the book, he starts off by talking about the societies of ancient Rome and ancient Greece and what it's like to live there. And I was surprised to find the degree to which ancestor worship was fundamental to their religion and their societies. Essentially, each family had its own cult around worshiping your ancestors. And you had a hearth in each home, and it was your duty to keep that hearth lit, the sacred fire going. So they'd have these bowls where you would keep the coals going. And it was incredibly important that you not let that fire go out. And they literally believed that your ancestors, these personal gods of yours, lived below your home. So you were very tied to this place and these people. And you were essentially a pawn in continuing this lineage and ensuring that your descendants could keep your fire lit as well. But he goes on to talk about their conception of private property at the time. And I thought it was really interesting because he'll talk about how they didn't actually have the right in many of these cities to sell their homes. You couldn't sell the property. Your wants and desires were so insignificant in comparison to the spiritual destiny of your family that your property wasn't really even yours. You were just a custodian for this ancestor worship cult of your family. Now, fast forwarding to modernity, when I fill out a job application, they give me 43 different ways to identify my pronouns. And then they'll ask me if I'm a non-white Hispanic 6 times, which I don't even really know what that means or why they're so intent on discovering that or what it has to do with the job. But today, our sense of self-conception goes down to a microbial level. I'm just thinking about who I am in every given situation and every day that ends in Y. It feels like the hurricanes of living your truth and an army of one have just formed this super cyclone of self-rumination that we're all caught up in all the time, thinking about ourselves and our sense of self-conception. And I've been on this real documentary kick lately. There's a network called Slice on YouTube, and they have all kinds of documentaries, but I've been watching ones about nomadic people, specifically in Mongolia and Afghanistan. And there's this group of Kyrgyz people in northern Afghanistan who are essentially trapped in the Pamir there, this region, this narrow strip of land, because of the way that the country maps were drawn. They can't leave. And I think it was shot in 2018, so it's relatively recent. But they have a sheep-based economy, and they have hundreds of miles in order to take their flocks across to find grazing lands in order to fatten up their sheep and then sell them. But they're incredibly poor. It's a subsistence level of lifestyle. And I was shocked to find out that these people still buy their wives. There are so few women in the area, and because the infant and female mortality rate is so high in childbirth that there's been a real shortage of women, which has caused them to complain at the rise in wife prices. It's 100 sheep now to buy a wife when it used to be much less. And then they're comparing that to, well, it's 30 sheep for a good camel and 40 sheep for a good horse. So they live in a much different world than us. But to my lights, their primary concern was the maintenance of their family's flock to ensure that they could keep grazing these ancestral lands that contained their family's ancestors. They were tied to this place and wanting to continue this thing for their descendants. They wanted their children to be married. It was incredibly important to them. They were part of this larger unit that had to ensure its own continuation. And I don't envy buying a bride. I dare say none of us would. But it was really clarifying seeing a life that was organized around something totally external to you. Not that they don't have internal worlds or think about this stuff, but their primary concerns were definitely external and more grounded in continuing their family's legacies. And again, I fast forward to my sense of self-concern. I'll wonder if the fact that I haven't seen all of the Oscar winners makes me uninformed. Man, should I have seen Sinners already? Should I tell people that I've seen Sinners? I don't know, but those are my sense of self-concern and rumination. I recently finished this book called The Passion of the Western Mind by Richard Tarnas, and it's made me have epistemology on the brain, because I'm wondering how we've come to think about what is true, and if that gives any more weight to my internal chatter and what I believe to be true about myself. We're at the year 1226, and I had the same sense of incessant rumination about myself. Would I just chalk that up to God's will? Would I say, he's testing me. There's some revealed truth here, and I can leave that up to some divinity? Or if it were a few hundred years later, if it was 1626, would I think that there's a logical deduction that I can make from these thoughts? And it's an interesting philosophical statement, but maybe there's not much more beyond that. But because now empirical observation is the height of how we assess if something's true or not, does that mean that everything I notice about myself, my brain says this is a data point that is around something that is actually happening, and you need to notice this as being true about yourself? The word the word anxiety is thrown around all the time now. People are much more anxious, and it seems like the stuff about the anxious generation has some truth to it, at least when you look at the data or how people report it themselves. And it's probably overdetermined why why everyone maybe is so much more anxious now. I would love to blame technology for all of that, and I think it has a large part to play. But I think some of the gravitas that we give to anxiety comes from the fact that we now think we're all perpetually responsible for having these coherent relationships with ourselves. I have to know what everything that my brain says about me may or may not be true, how it impacts my concept of self. I'm constantly forming my identity and questioning it all the time. And it's not just the things that I've failed to do or not to do or think, but the identity that I failed to become. Something about this is just wrapped up in, again, how I am ordering myself, not just thoughts that I'm having, but things that I'm noticing about the person that I am. And it is endless. There's a courtroom inside of my brain where I am the prosecution and the defense. And I think that's the trap of all this, is that I will give enormous weight to how my brain is ordering my personality in any given moment. Who am I? Who am I becoming? What's my perception? It's just all about me all the time. The primacy of the individual and the self is fundamental to being in our society, and I wouldn't have it any other way. But the weight of our destiny has now been placed on our own shoulders. And in some ways that's fantastic. In other ways it is terrifying and it is exhausting. I will treat myself like an individual. There's a third person view constantly wondering, what the hell is this guy doing? Why did he say that? Why do you think you need to be funny all the time? What's wrong with you? Those sorts of things. And I have been running an intense clinical trial on myself for about 34 years, and I have not reached any profound conclusions yet. The sands of my identity are just constantly shifting beneath my feet. Is that a problem that I'm doing that? I mean, when it becomes pathological, maybe. Otherwise, maybe not. How else do we relate to one another in a free society other than being individuals? But it's genuinely hard for my brain to see how it would feel for it to be another way. I cannot opt out of my own consciousness, not if I want to keep living. I think that having a pluralistic view of oneself and identity makes us feel a bit more stabilizing. The idea that I'm not just this person, but I'm made up of my identities as a son or a friend or a father or dad or whatever that is for you. But I do think it's an amalgamation, and it's still doing this work of me trying to craft my identity. But I really want to run some experiments around this in order to understand. I want to let 100 toddlers raise themselves in the Yucatan and then ask them, how do they describe themselves? How do you think about yourself? I want to know what the ticker tape of their internal dialogue would look like. It makes me wonder if tribalism is the opposite of individualism. If individualism is the idea that you are your own moral agent with a complex set of preferences, then is tribalism just a group identity with group preferences? What does that feel like? Maybe that's what feels so good about an unadulterated sense of partisanship or tribalism. It just requires less of my own moral accounting and self-formation. I can be subsumed by this larger identity that doesn't require me to form my own thesis of the universe. And something about that feels good in theory, because it feels like the alternative is just watching myself talk about who I may or may not be until I'm in the nursing home. And all of this just makes me want to take myself less seriously. I don't even reliably know what I want to eat for lunch. So who the hell do I think I am? I don't think that the concept of self was meant to consume all of our waking hours. I have so much more free time than my ancestors, and it's largely spent reflecting on how I am or am not failing to become the self that I want to be. And there's a teleological narcissism here where I'm constantly measuring myself against my own platonic ideal of an imagined me. I'll think, does this make me seem like a good person? Would a righteous person do that? What does this say about me? How am I being perceived? Now, there's no putting the self back in the bottle, as it were. And again, the invention of the individual is actually one of the greatest things that we've ever conceived of. So I don't think that there's a solution to this per se. But I found it somewhat liberating to realize that the courtroom drama playing out in my head doesn't necessarily signal the onset of schizophrenia. It's just myself trying to construct myself and live in our world, our society. There's a phrase that I heard the other day that I think captures this. Problems without solutions are just a fact of life, which maybe that makes it worse in some regards, but I think that it takes a lot of the pressure off. Now, to peel some of the kimono of the show back for a moment, the way I go about picking topics for any given week is I've got a little pad that I'll keep with me, and I'll write down questions I have throughout the week. If I have some interesting, quasi-interesting thought or something I'm reading, I'll jot it down. And I had the observation about all this self-rumination about my identity this week, and I thought, hey, maybe there's something interesting there. Let's write about that. So I wrote about it for a while, and then at some point, during exploring that idea, I'll lift my head up and I'll say, you know what, is this derivative? Am I just wanting to be perceived as somebody having insights about the nature of reality? What does this say about the type of person I am that I want people to think I am? And eventually I just have to tell my internal dialogue to shut the up and write this thing and say what you're going to say and live your life and laugh it off. So if you ever think that I am a properly structured person, just know under the hood, it's much more chaotic than that. I wanted to end with this because I don't have an answer to all of these questions, but I want to do more of that, of not taking myself as seriously all the time and just trying to live my life knowing that there's going to be this constant internal dialogue around who I am perpetually because of the society that we live in, and that I shouldn't listen to it all the time. That's all I have for today. So I hope you enjoyed hanging out with me. And until next time, I am praying for rain.